Chapter 5, Part 1 of the Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt. The personality of Thoreau was one which seldom failed to arrest the attention of those who met him. He was short of stature, says Mr. Moncure Conway, who visited him a few years after he left Walden, well built, and such a man as I have fancied Julius Caesar to have been. Every movement was full of courage and repose. The tones of his voice were those of truth herself, and there was in his eye the pure bright blue of the New England sky, as there was sunshine in his flaxen hair. He had a particularly strong aquiline Roman nose, which somehow reminded me of the prow of a ship. This description is fully corroborated by that given in Thoreau, the poet naturalist, by Ellery Channing, who, from his long and intimate acquaintance with Thoreau, could speak with peculiar authority. His face, once seen, could not be forgotten. The features were quite marked. The nose aquiline or very Roman, like one of the portraits of Caesar, more like a beak, as was said. Large overhanging brows above the deepest set blue eyes that could be seen, in certain lights, and in others gray. Eyes expressive of all shades of feeling, but never weak or nearsighted. The forehead not unusually broad or high, full of concentrated energy or purpose. The mouth with prominent lips, pursed up with meaning and thought when silent, and giving out when open a stream of the most varied and unusual and instructive sayings. His whole figure had an active earnestness, as if he had no moment to waste. Even in the boat he had a wary, transitory air, his eyes on the outlook. Perhaps there might be ducks, or the Blondin turtle, or an otter or sparrow. From 1840 to 1860, Thoreau's figure must have been a very familiar one to his fellow townsmen of Concord, since he was abroad in all weathers and at all hours, a noticeable man, with his sloping shoulders, his eyes bent on the ground, his long swinging gait, his hands perhaps clasped behind him or held closely at his side, the fingers made into a fist. The indomitable spirit that animated his whole character was written unmistakably in his personal appearance. How deep and clear is the mark that thought sets upon a man's face, was the exclamation of one who saw him for the first time. Footnote: there are 3 portraits of Thoreau which have been reproduced in various forms. 1. A crayon done by S. W. Rouse, a young artist who stayed with the Thoreaus, in 1854, before the time when Thoreau wore a beard. 2. A photograph by Crichton, taken at Worcester, Massachusetts, in 1857 or 1858, not in 1861, as has been wrongly stated. Thoreau here appears with a fringe of beard on his throat. 3. An ambrotype photograph taken by Dunshee at New Bedford at the request of Mr. Daniel Ricketson in August 1861, when Thoreau was wearing a full beard and mustache. From this photograph a bas-relief medallion head, in profile, life-size, was produced by Mr. Walton Ricketson, the son of Thoreau's friend. End footnote. The homeliness of Thoreau's mode of dress has already been noticed, and this during his more lengthy walks or excursions, often led to strange errors as to his object and vocation. In Cape Cod and elsewhere he was several times mistaken for a peddler, and on board a steamboat on the Hudson River he was once asked for a chaw of baccy by a bystander, who took him for a shipmate. It is said that his speech always had a burr in it, owing to his peculiar pronunciation of the letter R. But all his oddities of appearance and manner were soon forgotten under the singular charm of his conversation, the power of which is attested by all who knew him. He himself says, in a passage of his diary, that his bon mots were the ripe, dry fruit of long past experience, which fell from him easily without giving him either pain or pleasure. This experience was not gathered, as is usually the case, by foreign travel or a varied manner of life, but by shrewd native sense and keen practical insight. There was a wonderful fitness, Emerson tells us, between his body and mind. He was expert as a walker, swimmer, runner, rower, and in all outdoor employments. He could measure any given distance or height by foot or eye with extraordinary precision, could estimate the exact weight of anything put into his hands, and from a box containing a bushel or more of loose pencils could take up just a dozen pencils at every grasp. In 1847, in answer to a circular which was issued at the time for the purpose of collecting facts in the lives of the Harvard class of 1837, Thoreau wrote the following highly characteristic letter: "Am not married. I don't know whether mine is a profession or a trade or what not. It is not yet learned, and in every instance has been practiced before being studied. The mercantile part of it was begun by myself alone. It is not one, but legion. I will give you some of the monsters' heads. I am a schoolmaster, a private tutor, a surveyor, a gardener, a farmer, a painter, I mean a house painter, a carpenter, a mason, a day laborer, a pencil maker, a glass paper maker, a writer, and sometimes a poetister. If you will act the part of Iolus, and apply a hot iron to any of these heads, I shall be greatly obliged to you. My present employment is to answer such orders as may be expected from so general an advertisement as the above. That is, if I see fit, which is not always the case, for I have found out a way to live without what is commonly called employment or industry, attractive or otherwise. Indeed, my steadiest employment, if such it can be called, is to keep myself at the top of my condition and ready for whatever may turn up in heaven or on earth. The last 2 or 3 years I lived in Concord Woods alone, something more than a mile from any neighbor, in a house built entirely by myself. P.S. I beg that the class will not consider me an object of charity, and if any of them are in want of any pecuniary assistance and will make known their case to me, I will engage to give them some advice of more worth than money." Footnote: From Memorials of the Class of 1837, prepared for the 50th anniversary of the graduation by Henry Williams, Boston, 1887. End footnote. He has sometimes been called an ascetic, but if he seldom used flesh or wine, tea or coffee, and other supposed necessaries of diet. This abstinence was assuredly due to the fact that he found he thus increased, rather than diminished, the pleasure of existence. The rare delicacy of his nature showed itself in his abhorrence of every form of sensuality or grossness, and in his expressed desire to live as tenderly and daintily as one would pluck a flower. Yet seldom has there been a greater lover of healthy physical life. The keenness of his senses was extraordinary, and the perceptions of color, sound, smell, and taste are always spoken of in his diaries as luxuries for which he can never be sufficiently grateful. Music had at all times a peculiar attraction for him. He was himself a skilful player on the flute, and is repeatedly mentioned in the diaries and letters as one of the supreme delights of life. But if we wish to discover the central and distinctive quality of Thoreau's character, we must look beyond the above-mentioned faculties to the inner secret of his power, the ideality that dominated all his thoughts and actions. He was a transcendentalist in a far deeper and more literal sense than the majority of those who bore that name. It was this ideality that gave to his character a certain external coldness and remoteness. "I love Henry," said one of his friends, "but I cannot like him. And as for taking his arm, I should as soon think of taking the arm of an elm tree." The misunderstandings thus generated were keenly felt by Thoreau himself, who rightly attributes them to his own extreme sensibility and exacting disposition. There are a number of passages in the diaries, perhaps not to be taken very literally, in which his oversensitive nature seems to be tormented by unnecessary doubts as to his relations with his friends, and this rigid strictness of ideal is especially observable in his essays on love and friendship, the latter of which forms a portion of one of the best-known chapters in The Week. Thus it was that the very value which Thoreau set on his friendships was his chief difficulty in maintaining them, their rarity being to him the measure of their worth, so that, with a few exceptions, he turned to nature for what he could not find in man. It is only fair to add that Ellery Channing, who, as Thoreau's most intimate friend, should be an authority on this point, asserts positively that the essay on friendship was poetical and romantic, and that to read it literally would be to accuse its author of stupidity. "The living actual friendship and affection," says Channing, "which makes time a reality, no one knew better. He meant friendship and meant nothing else, and stood by it without the slightest abatement." To a man of this temperament, who needed leisure, breathing space, and elbow room, and could not endure to be shut up in polite drawing-rooms and dining-rooms, where the guests jostled each other mentally and bodily, and where all true individuality was hidden and wasted, the frivolities and formalities of conventional society could not be otherwise than a burden and an irritant. Under such conditions he became contradictory and pugnacious, and marred the course of conversation by the promptitude with which he negatived every proposition that might be advanced, most of all when he detected any signs of hypocrisy, foppishness, or dilettantism. The sharp sayings and still more accusing silences, as Emerson terms them, which Thoreau dealt out to all pretentious personages, had, of course, the effect of getting him the reputation of cynicism and misanthropy. Those readers, however, who rightly appreciate his character will distinguish between the normal churlishness, which certainly was not one of his failings, and the occasional acridity of speech which he deliberately adopted in his intercourse with his fellow citizens. If he had any affection in his sincere and aspiring nature, wrote one who knew him well, Mr. Edward Hoare of Concord, it was a sort of inherited petulance that covered a sensitive and affectionate nature, easily wounded by the scornful criticism which his new departure sometimes brought upon him. To style Thoreau a misanthrope is to misunderstand his whole nature, and to do him a great injustice. He loved to study all forms of innocent and healthy character, and in one of his works he quotes, as specially applicable to himself, Terence's famous maxim of regard for our common humanity. Had he been the mere fastidious recluse that some critics have supposed him, he could not have drawn his sympathetic and humorous sketches of the sturdy Concord farmers, or of the hardy, unsophisticated woodchopper by whom he was visited at Walden, or of the aged, brown-coated fisherman who haunted the banks of the Musketaquid, or of the drunken Dutchman on board a New York steamboat, or of the merry old oysterman who gave him hospitality at Cape Cod. For idealist and enthusiast though he was, he possessed a true vein of humor, which is none the less piquant because it is expressed in a manner so dry, pithy, and laconic. It is pleasant, too, to note that the gravity which the habitual with the hermit and philosopher could melt, when occasion arose, into merriment and good fellowship, and that when he laughed the operation was sufficient to split a pitcher. He was fond of playing on his flute, and would at times sing Tom Bowling and other nautical songs with much gusto and animation, and it is even recorded that he once or twice startled his friends by performing an improvised dance. Reference has already been made to his sympathy with children, and his remarkable power of interesting and amusing them. He would tell them stories, sing to them, and play on his flute, or perform various pieces of jugglery for their entertainment, an accomplishment which he had probably learnt from his eccentric uncle, Charles Dunbar, in whose oddities he always took much interest. But it was in the huckleberry expeditions that his services were in greatest request, for then he would drive the hay cart in which the children journeyed to the hills where the berries abounded. And who knew each knoll and dingle so intimately as Thoreau? Leading the frolic with his jokes and laughter as they jolted along. When we read the delightful accounts of his kindness and helpfulness on these occasions, we know how to estimate the charges of misanthropy and churlishness. Though shy of general society, says the writer of the Reminiscences in Fraser, Thoreau was a hero among children and the captain of their excursions. He was the sine qua non of the Concord Huckleberry Party, which is in that region something of an institution. To have Thoreau along with them was to be sure of finding acres of bushes laden with the delicious fruit. A child stumbles and falls, losing his carefully gathered store of berries. Thoreau kneels beside the weeping unfortunate and explains to him and the group that nature has made these little provisions for next year's crop. If there were no obstacles and little boys did not fall occasionally, how would berries be scattered and planted? And what would become of huckleberryings? He will then arrange that he who has thus suffered for the general good shall have the first chance at the next pasture. The severity of Thoreau's ideal was not less conspicuous in matters of business than in his relations towards his friends. He was absolutely and austerely faithful to his inner sense of right, keeping his engagements with stern regularity, and never failing in the full discharge of his duty to those who engaged him as surveyor or handicraftsman. Himself thus inflexible in his probity, he expected and exacted a corresponding uprightness in others, and where this was not exhibited, he made no polite pretense of concealing his dissatisfaction. No meanness, hypocrisy, or dishonesty, whether on the part of rich or poor, could escape the rigorous censure of that terrible Thoreau, as his acquaintances called him, nor would he waste on thriftless applicants 1 cent of the money which he had earned by his own conscientious labors. He maintained sincerity to be the chief of all virtues. A Yankee Stoic is a term that has been applied to Thoreau. Though cosmopolitan in his philosophical views, he was American to the backbone in sentiment and manner, and did not study to conceal his indifference or aversion for English and European fashions. He possessed in large measure the American qualities of self-consciousness and self-assertion, and avows in Walden his intention to brag as lustily as Chanticleer in the morning, in order to wake up his neighbors. And as America was the most favored of countries, so did he extol his native Concord as the most favored of towns. This preference, however, was not due, as some have supposed, to mere parochialism and narrowness of mind, for parochialism, the study of the little instead of the great, was certainly not one of Thoreau's failings, but was, as Emerson has pointed out, a half-serious, half-humorous way of reasserting the old stoical maxim that all places are the same to a wise man, and that the best place for each is where he stands. On the same principle, being asked at table what dish he preferred, he is said to have answered, "The nearest." End of Chapter 5, Part 1.